everyone, and welcome to a new video. It has been a little while since I made a video. I think my last one was in December 2022, because time flies when you're clinically depressed. But you know what hasn't been airing for even longer? House of the Dragon. I am not self-absorbed enough to think that people are still interested in me and what I'm capable of making after 18 months of not making any videos at all. But people are definitely still interested in House of the Dragon, so I'm going to try and piggyback off of that hype and success by making something sort of inspired by the show and to wear while watching the show. I've wanted to make another dragon-inspired costume for a long time, and I do say another because one of my favorite projects I've ever made and one of my last videos was about making a dragon-inspired dress, and I ended up making a matching menswear ensemble. And then the last thing I made before not sewing for like a year was a set of dragon pauldrons. I've also hoarded quite a lot of dragon-scaled printed brocades and fabrics that I really want to use, but it's been hard to settle on a design because there are just so many different options. It wasn't until I realized the show was coming out in a week and I wanted to make something for it that I realized I just had to commit to a design and get going. And that is how this dress ended up being made. And I'm so glad that it did because I really like dragons. I feel like people associate me with unicorns because I have several hundred figurines of them in this room right now. But I like mythical creatures of all different shapes and species and sizes, and dragons definitely fall into that category. How to Train Your Dragon has been my favorite movie for pretty much ever. I got really into World of Warcraft when Dragonflight came out, and I even have a dragon tattoo. And I think I'm saying all of this to try and prove that I like dragons before they were cool, but we know that dragons have been cool for literally ever. Like, seriously, in 1260, they were totally the envy of everyone in the bestiary, and I don't think much has changed since then. And hopefully I can make a dress that does them justice, or at least I can try. I began by trying to drape a pattern on my dress form, and this was the first time I'd done this in well over a year, so that was interesting, but it actually turned out pretty great. And you know what? This mock-up turned out pretty great too. This is the first mock-up and pattern I've made in a very, very long time. That was it when it came off the dress form, and then I just traced it onto a thick canvas and added some seam allowance and sewed it all together. Well, throw it on and see what it looks like. The fit in the shoulders was perfect, and there wasn't any gaping around the neckline or at the back, which is pretty much a miracle. So this is what the first mock-up looks like, and this is the second fitting of the first mock-up. So I didn't end up having to recut it because it fit well enough that I didn't need to make super major alterations. I did make a couple. So this is where the underbust is. It ended up being too big there, and I decided I would take it in below that point. And then I also ended up taking in the side by a 1/2 inch. So I just creased it vertically and then sewed a 1/4 inch away from the crease. Here are some worn photos of the alterations, and in these photos I've also added bust cuts to the bodice because I didn't feel like there's enough definition and I thought this would make it more flattering. And with that declared good enough, I cut the mock-up apart and used it to make a pattern for the bodice. And now I'm going to be putting together the base layer. I still haven't quite figured out how I'm going to construct this, but I know there has to be boating in it. I know there has to be a sort of structural layer to go beneath everything else. So that's what I've cut out so far. So this is my base layer all sewn together. I've sewn around the perimeter to mark the seam point. And I actually sewed things that had to be basted because these need to be visible on the interior. So like that's where a bust cut goes. And then I did the same for the dart. I didn't explain this very well, but I'm basically using thread to base these layers together and to transfer and create guides for future construction that are visible on both sides of the fabric, such as boning channels, the points where the side panels end, the seam allowance, the hem allowance, the bust cut placements, and the darts. So now I'm just going through and marking the seam allowance, and I don't actually know what size of seams I want to use for all of these pieces. So if I don't know, then I'm just marking 1 inch because that's the largest possible seam allowance I would need. So if I cut it there, then I know I'm not cutting it too small. But there are some that I know are going to be smaller, just because it's going to be hard to be precise if it's that wide. And also the wider the seams, the more bulk you're adding. And since we're working with the base layer, we don't really want to add more bulk than we need to, unless it's structurally important. Now I'm going to be referring a lot to a base layer, and I just want to establish what that is in case you don't know. So the lining layer is what's closest to the skin. The base layer offers structural component to the bodice. Then the fashion fabric is just there to look pretty. For my fashion fabric for the bodice, I'm using a chemically pleated satin and this crepe, which both kind of have scale prints to them. Both these fabrics are very flimsy, and neither of them would make a very good bodice, on their own at least. So those are going to be on the exterior, and then the interior is going to be made up of a medium weight canvas and a black cotton broadcloth, which is going to be the lining. Now I'm sewing these together from the get-go because I'm using a method called flat lining for the majority of this piece, but sometimes, oftentimes even, these are separate components. And now some of those pieces are being cut down to the proper dimensions for construction, whereas others will be cut to size after basting them to the fashion fabric, so all of the edges line up perfectly. You can see me doing that here with the side panel and the scaled crepe, and I'm making sure the grain line and placement of the scales are symmetrical and running horizontally across the pieces, but I'm only roughly cutting them out. These are the back panels, and I wanted the vertical pattern of the fabric to be parallel to the center back edge. So I was very careful with placing these, and in the end, I think it worked out pretty nicely. A lot of things with this dress did not turn out nicely, so I just want to take this moment to gloat while things are still going well. Here I'm basting the base layers to the fashion fabric. Something to note here is that you have to leave either the top or the bottom edge loose, because if you stitch across it, you will stitch closed all of the boning channels. Not that I know that from personal experience or anything, but trust me, it's a pain when you accidentally do. And in case you didn't know, boning channels can be made out of a twill tape or ribbon that is sewn to the base layer, or they can be made by sewing 2 layers of fabric together, and between them there's a little pocket that the boning can go into. And that's the method that I'm using for this bodice. And that is another reason that I'm flatlining these pieces. Now all of the darts are pinned, and I pinned them in such a way that I can sew from the widest point to the smallest point and sort of taper off to nothing. That's how I prefer to sew them, so I make sure to pin them that way. And this was the point of the project where I was still trying to film a lot, so there's even footage of me sewing these darts. Now I'm cutting the fashion fabric layer of the side panels down to match the dimensions of the base layer. And I did end up leaving 1-inch seam allowance at each edge, which you can see here, because the final dimensions of the piece were marked with thread that goes through all of the layers, which is convenient because it will mark the point where the front panels will lap over and be top stitched down. But first I have to fold the edges of the front panel inward. So this portion is going to be folded inward or outward, depending on how you look at it, at the line that I have stitched, which is a 1/2 inch away from the edge. And it creates a really nice little guide for this, which is, almost like I planned it. And something I just want to mention now before I forget it, if you don't know how long your seam allowance is going to be, like you're planning on cutting it down later, or you think you might have to cut it down later, you need to backstitch where the pieces are going to meet, not at the end of the fabric. Because otherwise you can cut away your backstitching and then seams start to unravel at the waist, and it's not a great look. So now the handy thing is, you can see that line of stitching, I would hope, because it's gray. The right side actually is black stitching, so it's harder for you guys to see, and that means that if any of it ends up being exposed, it will be hard for anyone to see when the garment's worn. But I'm just going to example this on the back where you can see it. But now I know this is the line where I want the pieces to meet, so I can just line that edge up with the line of stitching and top stitch them together there. Also, while in here, I want to note that these panels are only stitched on to a specific point, and then the side panel is left loose above that point to allow for the arm side to be finished later on. And then I went through and I folded this entire edge on the stitch line, and now it is time to get the back piece sewn on. And this dart lines up with the top edge of that, so that'll make it really easy to line up. And then I can just line up this edge with that stitch line. Here's what it looks like after being pinned together. This was after I stopped trying to be a good YouTuber, so I do not have footage of actually sewing it. And then I set about trying to finish the side front, and I did a bad job. I ended up ripping off that little piece of twill tape because even though it's on the interior, it looked so ugly. So what I ended up doing was putting the twill tape on the outside, so that is the boning channel, and I just top stitched the seam allowance down and cut it with pinking shears. And I repeated the same thing for the back. And then I sewed on this lacing tape to the front edges of the bodice. And this I bought on Etsy, but it is neither the most economical option nor the strongest. So you can totally make your own out of D-rings if you would like. It just requires both effort and precise measurements. And I try to avoid both of those things as much as possible. And I bet someone in the comments is gearing up to be sassy and say, "We can tell." And you know what? I respect that because you're not wrong. And then on the back side, I sewed a piece of twill tape over the seam allowance, and that is where a bone is going to go at the front to stabilize it. And then I ended up having to move the boning channel that was here over a little bit. So now there are 4 boning channels in this tiny little section, but that's where it needs the most support. So hopefully that should be good. What wasn't good was accidentally sewing over top of that boning channel when sewing on trim and not noticing until it was much too late to fix it. But at least there wasn't boning in the channel at the time, and no sewing machine needles were harmed in the construction of this bottom. That's how it looks from the interior right now. And then from the exterior, it looks very, very ugly. But it's going to be cute in the end, I promise. Also, if you're wondering why I haven't finished this back seam, which looks terrible, or sewn down the hem of it, which also looks terrible, it's because I want to be able to make alterations here if I need to. So I want to leave the construction there as simple as possible and leave the seam allowance as large as possible. It's funny looking at this right now because the interior is so much prettier than the exterior, but you have to remember that the outward facing raw edges will all be covered. As I have beautifully illustrated here, graphic design is clearly my passion. And I think next up I'm going to try and figure out what I'm going to do to cover this. So what the different dimensions are going to be and stuff. And I have to figure out if I want to try and sew that on. Well, it can be laid relatively flat, or if I want to do that after this seam is sewn up. I'm not sure which is going to be easier. But before we could make the scale trim, I had to figure out how to make the scale trim. Because despite it being very much essential to this project's design, I'd yet to do any testing on how to make it both defined and even and durable, while also preventing it from breaking. I did, however, get very lucky, and my first test went really well, and ended up being the technique that I used for all of the trim on the costume. In this footage, I have the strips basted to the lace, so it won't shift out of place when I'm sewing. But in this footage, I'm a step behind that, and I'm actually cutting out the strips in the first place. And the width of these was not determined by any technical manner at all. I just wanted to make sure it was wide enough to sew onto the garment once the other edge was finished. You'll see me make more of this later, but all I really did was sew very close to the edge of each scale in one of the horizontal rows, using a very small stitch length. The smaller stitch length allows more precision and better secures the fibers of the fabric together, which will help prevent fraying, I hope. Seriously though, I was pretty abusive to the bodice while constructing it. I handled it a lot after sewing this trim onto it, and it hasn't frayed at all, so I'm really pleased with how this method worked and how durable it has proven to be. It also lays really flat and nicely over the underskirt, which is truly thanks to the stiffness of the lace, so that was a good move on my part. Anyway, in this footage, I'm cutting very close, but not too close to that stitching. I'd say like 1/6 of an inch away, approximately, enough that you can melt it a decent amount without singeing the stitching. But not so much that when you melt it, there's so much to melt that it gets an evening walk. With everything trimmed, I'm using a candle to melt the edges. When doing this, you don't want to stick the fabric in the flame or light it on fire. You just want to get it close enough that the heat melts the fibers together. If I was more clever, this is where I'd make a Song and Ice of Fire joke, but I think I killed too many brain cells in the process of inhaling these fumes to be capable of that right now. And I'm only kind of kidding. I really should have opened a window or something. I also want to apologize for how dingy my desk looks. I swear it's clean, but it really needs to be repainted. So I'm definitely doing that before I film anything else. And I'm also sorry if you hadn't noticed how dingy it looks until this point, and now you're going to notice it for the rest of the video. Alright, so I finished all the trim and I just pinned on one of these sections. I'm really pleased with how that looks. I think I'm going to secure on the outer edge by hand, but this inner edge is just going to be machine basted down, and then I can start figuring out the satin overlay that's going to go on top of it. I sewed it on by machine, and I did gather the fabric slightly so it would follow the concave curve of the neckline. And here's a friendly reminder of what a concave curve looks like, because my channel is educational. Now I'm just going through and fixing up some of these scales that were a bit misshapen. This section of trim is the first section of trim that I made, so it came out the worst of the 4 different pieces that I made, and it just needed a little bit of extra help. And once that was done, I'm ironing it so it sits very flat against the base layer. Okay, so a couple notes. It's been like an hour, and nothing has really changed except for me ironing this. But I've been playing around a lot with these strips that are going to go over top of this and cover this lining section, trying to get them lined up. And it's been harder than I thought because I didn't measure things correctly. So like this part is wider than a single band of the satin. So I'm trying to figure that out. I was not being clear here at all, but what I was trying to say is that the satin I'm using has a vertical repeat of approximately 4 inches, and I want to use a single 4-inch piece to cover the front collarish portion of this bodice, but I made it slightly too wide to accomplish that. Because God forbid I use a ruler or anything. My giant container of rulers is glaring at me so hard right now. Seriously though, they're all in a head-shaped phase and she looks very mad at me. In trying to figure this out, I've also remembered that I want the sleeves to tie on. So they aren't actually seamed on, which means I don't need seam allowance here. I need these edges to be finished. This has an inch of seam allowance. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut that down. I'm just gonna bind it. I was coming to cut this and I was like, oh man, it's gonna be a pain to cut because this jacquard fabric is a little bit puffy and like loosely woven. So it's actually really difficult to cut straight, and it's also difficult to mark on. But for bias cut strips, you basically just need strips cut on the bias or the diagonal of the fabric that are an even width. And these scales are on the diagonal of the fabric and they're an even width apart. So I didn't have to measure anything. I just had to follow the scale pattern. For many years, I just made bias tape by folding the edges inward, but in the year and a half I've been gone, I did purchase this little doohickey, and it is a bias tape maker. I still don't feel like it's really necessary, but it definitely doesn't hurt. I was using it the other day when I was binding the front panels of this, which I think I did off camera. I might have cut my strips too wide for this to be super even, or I might just be bad at this. Could be both. It does make it very even, like more even than my attempts to do it by eye ever were. So I suppose this has some merit. But that being said, that actually didn't end up that even. I think I just cut my fabric a little bit too wide for this. I'm not going to recut it because I don't have a ton of this fabric. It was kind of expensive actually, which is why I only got it in 2 colors instead of 3 colors like I wanted to, because I also had it in green. So if this video does well at all, you know I'm going through and I'm buying it in green. But given the affiliation this video has with House of the Dragon, I don't know if I'm to be using green fabric. I already have the green hair, so you know, I'm sort of showing my bias. Bias tape, bias. Seriously, I'm neither team black nor team green, but team attractive people in silver wigs, which in that show is everyone. So now we have some beautiful bias tape. As for where it is being sewn to, but before I can actually sew anything to it, I have to trim it pretty substantially. Luckily, that is easy to do because of the outline I stitched when basting these layers together. And then I sewed bias binding onto that freshly trimmed edge, and ta-da! Armholes are done. And that remaining a little bit of the front panel could be stitched down. But it would not stay stitched down for long. And neither would this bias binding stay on this garment for long. I was so young and naive at this point, and by that I mean 4 days ago. It's been a long 4 days though. I ended up ripping this off and redoing it 2 more times in the days to come, so stay tuned for the footage of my real-time complaining about that. I did, however, get the satin pinned in place and the edges stitched down. This took me like 2 hours of fussing, and I'm not even kidding. And this is all that I filmed at night. So I got that sewn on. It's not perfect, but I'm working with it. I've decided I'm not going to have trim here, but I am going to have trim here. So this edge looks sloppier, and I'm aware of it. But there's always a but. I feel like the arm size is too high. This needs to be lowered, which is so deeply annoying given how it is now sewn on. I did in fact remove it, and then it got re-sewn on, and I was so proud of myself until I tried it on later that night. And I wish I had done a fitting of this when I had it all unpicked earlier, because as you might remember, actually I'm not sure if I filmed it or not, if I was too pissed off to film it, but I did end up removing this and cutting it down by about a 1/2 inch, and though now I like where it hits at the points where it joins to the front and back panels, I think it needs to go much, much lower to be really very comfortable when it's worn. It's definitely passable as it is, but I'm not happy with it. I'd really like to be happy with it. On the bright side, my 3rd attempt was the prettiest by far. I paid way more attention to the pattern on the binding this time, so it is nice and symmetrical. Very pleased to say that that looks so much better. So now I'm just going to re-sew up this part, and then maybe I can even consider getting trim sewn on, which would be exciting. And then this just needs boning. And that's pretty much it for this part of the bodice, which is crazy. So exciting. I say that is pretty much it. Like, adding boning and trim and finishings isn't the most time-consuming part of sewing for me. But fitting is definitely the most overwhelming part for me at the moment, so I was happy to be confident in that at least. And I'm skipping over the trim talk for now because I totally forgot to film the process of sewing it onto the bodice, but we will circle back to that when we get to the sleeves, I promise. And speaking of forgetting, alright, so I realized this morning that I forgot to do something before sewing these pieces last night. So now I'm trying to do that before I forget again. So basically I want to add this little panel of scales. So this section of the skirt is going to be made out of scales fabric, and it will all nicely flow. So in order to do that, I have to make a little piece to sew on here. And ideally I would have done that before sewing this down, because then I could have just tucked the edges underneath this. Luckily I haven't sewn down the scales yet, so I can still hide it underneath there. I'm just going to have to sew it by hand, but that really is fine. But what I have to do is I have to finish this top edge so it looks like scales like the rest of the trim. And to do that, I'm going to sew very close to the edge of the scales, and I'm going to back it with a little bit of lace, which just gives it more structural integrity. So I've roughly cut it out, but I'm leaving a pretty large margin around where I want to sew, just because that makes it easier to handle. And now I'm going to sew right here in this black area around the scales. Now, I don't know if it's even going to show on camera, but I did do that line of stitching. You can kind of see it there, I think. And I will include a close-up photo, and maybe you'll be able to see the stitching there because it's not showing up on this camera. And now we're going to melt the edge. Note this is like my 3rd time ever lighting a match. We've always had electronic lighters, but ours is out of gas, so we're doing this today. And it's very, very close to my camera lens, so we're going to do this quickly before it hurts us. Speaking of hurting, oh my god, I had such a bad headache when I did the trim for the skirt this way. If you do it at all, do this in a well-ventilated area. I probably shouldn't be telling people to like melt plastic under any circumstances, but you've seen my hair. I am not a responsible looking person, so you should not expect me to behave like one. Also, my eyes really hurt from looking into the candle, like directly for an hour. Maybe also wear eye protection if you do that. That is what that looks like now that it just melted. It's not going to fray. And now I can get this sewn onto the back piece. That actually went so much better than I thought it would. So I was able to machine sew it on. I just folded these guys out of the way and then followed the basting stitch line that I could see from the interior. And now this can be folded over and sewn down. Also, I have tried it on now and it does fit, so I feel comfortable enough to hem at the top edge. Where I do any more hand sewing or fiddling or anything, I want to get the boning in because it's really easy to accidentally sew shut boning channels when you're sewing stuff onto the front side. So I'm going to add boning to this bodice. I've already selected the pieces I need, so I just have to file them and insert them. I'm using a mixture of plastic and pre-tipped steel bones. And once those are in, then I can start doing the finishing. I like sewing that scaled piece onto the back, fixing up the bias binding here. Also, since this fits, I can now sew this seam allowance down and I can hem this. So there are just a lot of little things and finishings to the interior that I can do once the boning's in. I did attempt to film this, but the lighting sucked, and this is when I realized I sewed some of the channels shut by accident, so I'm making the executive decision to cut this part completely. But rest assured, I did bone that bodice. It got inserted real good. When I did get the bones in, I basted along the bottom edge of the bodice so they couldn't escape. And now I can do hand sewing and finishings without worrying about those interfering with the boning channels. I wish I had thought of that a day earlier, but it's fine. I'm sewing down bits of bias binding I missed by the arm side, and I'm also cross-stitching down any seam allowance. The front edge of the base layer is getting cross-stitched to the scales as well, and a cross-stitch is sometimes called a catch stitch because you're just catching a few threads of the outer layer of fabric. So it looks like a whole lot from the interior, but you'll barely see it on the exterior. The reason I use this stitch over whip stitch is because it's very flexible and has some ease to it. So it should work really nicely around the neckline where it has to kind of conform to my chest, but there won't be a lot of strain on it. But I can't stray from my beloved whip stitch for long. I did use them for sewing down the hem on the back panel and the seam allowance at the center back. These are very, very loose and could easily be undone for alterations, but make it look a little bit nicer on the inside. And I think we could all benefit from being a bit nicer on the inside, you know? Alright, so I finished doing all of the stitching, and it doesn't look perfect inside, but it's fine. I also personally don't mind the contrasting thread on the interior. I used red because a lot of the stitching goes through to the front, and you just see a little teeny tiny bit from the front, like right there, and it's a tacking stitch to keep the scallops from peeling up and revealing what's underneath. But since you do see a little bit from the exterior, I wanted that thread to match what would potentially be visible. And I don't know, I think it looks sort of neat on the interior. But there are some stitch lines that have gray thread, which contrast pretty sharply. So I'm just going to use a Sharpie to change the color of that stitching. And this is totally aesthetic and unnecessary to the construction of the garment. FYI. But you know, a couple people might be seeing the interior of this, so might as well make it pretty. I've always liked being able to see some of the guts of the structure though. I think it's really cool. This isn't really structural, it's just the wrong color bobbin thread. And some of that was intentional because I was basically using the thread to mark where certain points and things were supposed to go, but I don't need it anymore, except for the bust cups, which I'm not sure if I'm going to add at this point, but I'm going to leave that stitching there just in case. I also want to mention that I did accidentally sew closed some of my boning channel, specifically the one right at the front, because I ended up adding that unexpected amount of trim, and that sewed too close to the edge and sewed over the boning casing. So there isn't a bone there, even though that's like probably one of the places where you really want one, but I think it will be fine without it, and if it isn't, I'll figure something out. Since it is such a visible point, I don't really want to rip the trim off there and then re-sew it on and potentially bugger it up. Yeah, it's just not something I really want to do unless I absolutely have to. So this is the bodice after all that, and it is pretty much ready to be sewn onto a skirt, which I guess means that we need to make a skirt. And by we need to make a skirt, I really mean I need to make a skirt, because you guys have really not been contributing a lot to this process, I must say. So I do very much appreciate you watching. And I hope you will stay watching next week when I get to actually making the skirt. I did sort of manage to finish this dress in a week. It is completely finished except for the hem, which is definitely not finished. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to finish a video about making the entire thing either, There was just too much footage and too many photos and too many scripts to write, and I couldn't get it done on time. So this video is kind of a consolation prize that you get to see the bodice in its finished state. And if you'd like to see how I made the skirt and the sleeves, then subscribe and stay tuned. And I'll have a video up about that next Sunday. And if you're already subscribed, then thank you so much for still being subscribed. I realize I've been gone a long time without any explanation, and I promise there is one coming. I've always been very upfront about my mental health struggles, and that definitely hasn't changed. I think I just wanted to prove to myself that I could make a video before I made a video about why I haven't been making videos. And I feel like I've done that now, so hopefully it is coming in the near future. But I really, really do appreciate you staying around and supporting me through all of this, especially the people over on Patreon. They've been so kind and so much kinder than I deserve. And I don't think I would be here without you guys, much less be in a place where I'm capable of creating things, and I want to create things, and I want to share them with you, and I'm capable of doing that too. So thank you so much for that gift that you have given me, and I'm going to try and give you the gift of some videos coming up in the near future. So thank you so much again, and I will see all of you next week.